of the Freeport Planning Board and Freeport Project Review Board. I think the last time we might have done this might have been to talk about the same issue pre-pandemic. So here we are again. We've been talking about updating Freeport's design review ordinance for quite a while as boards. It came to light during the Freeport downtown vision process how important this was. We were able to get funding from the town council, and the project is now underway. So we have here the Planning Board, Project Review Board, great representation. We do have one member of the Project Review Board online. We do have a consultant that was unfortunately ill and will be listening to the recording but couldn't join us today. So we have a hard stop at 5:30. I'm going to go ahead and have everyone just introduce themselves, what board they're on, their name. Well, we're going to start with Mitch because he's shy. So we'll start up, go across, we'll loop down to Andy, we'll end with Todd, and then we're going to have our consultants introduce themselves, and Cecilia and Brett also introduce yourselves as staff people. So Mitch, you're first.
I'm Mitch Ruda, I'm on the planning
Turn on
board.
your mic so you go on, please.
It is on, and I'm Mitch Ruda, I'm on the planning board.
Brett Richardson, I'm the development director with the town.
Sam Capala on the planning board.
Ford Reike, Project Review Board.
Bonnie Miles, Planning Board.
And Fred Madeira, Project Review Board.
Andrew Rosnell, planning board.
Jim Monteleone on the Project Review Board.
Wayne Jortner on the Planning Board.
Jason Donahue, Project Review.
Dave Spears on the planning board.
Linda Berger, Project Review Board.
Cecilia Smith, Assistant Town Planner.
Rosemary Burwell, Planning Board.
Todd Yankee, Project Review Board, and not that it's relevant, but also the Coastal Waters Commission.
Lynn Hamlin, Project Review Board.
Is anyone else on Zoom?
No, we do have former Project Review Board member, retired Guy Blanchard, on board as a member of the public.
All right, should we get going?
Yeah, get going.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Kate Birch. I'm a senior planner at North Star Planning. We are leading this design review ordinance update project with a team. I'll let Grace introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Grace McNeil. I'm a landscape designer at Aceto Landscape Architects. Our role on this project will be mostly based in helping rewrite the design ordinance and create some graphics to help show those ordinances.
And we also have an architectural historian on our team to support this project. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it tonight due to illness. That's Julie Larry from Black Diamond Consulting. Yeah, it's great to meet all of you. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to share kind of the initial work we've been doing to start this project with our first review of the ordinance and our initial thoughts and recommendations. And then we really want to sort of just hit some highlights and then turn it over to you to hear what you all are thinking, what your experiences with the ordinance have been. Then we will also talk a little bit about the planned public engagement and interviews for this project, and again, get some feedback from you on that. And I just also wanted to mention, I know we have limited time tonight, so if there's anything you don't get a chance to say in this meeting, please just follow up and send it over to Caroline, and she'll send it to us later. So yeah, I will give a short overview of our work, and then I will turn it over to you all to talk about this ordinance. So just a quick timeline for what this project is about 9 months long. We started with the ordinance audit and reviewing Freeport's past planning work. Highlighted there, we are at the Project Review Board Planning Board kickoff meeting, and we're starting to move into setting up some stakeholder interviews and planning for community engagement. And following that input, we will start developing new ordinance drafting, which includes both standards, a new written ordinance, and graphics from our design team. And then once we have a draft ordinance, we will be doing some additional zoning analysis to sort of see how this will fit into Freeport's existing ordinances and create a roadmap for implementation. So I wanted to just kind of touch on the high points of our ordinance audit. what we focused on, first of all, is clarity of procedures and standards. So how easy is it for someone to use this ordinance, both as a developer and as someone on a board who's reviewing a project, and staff as well, of course. So we have some recommendations related to organization and standardizing procedures and basically trying to make things as simple to use as possible. We did this by looking at Freeport's other ordinances. We want to aim for consistency between how it works to go through this process and make sure it fits in right with site plan review, subdivision review. We also focused a lot on the current ordinance's definitions, which some of them are a little unusual. Some of them are sort of more procedures that are hidden in the definitions section. Others, there's quite a few definitions around different types of compatibility, which is an important concept in this area, but is not always easy to explain in a definition. We'll talk a little more about that later. Our architectural historian reviewed this in terms of historic preservation practices. And then Grace and the design team really took a hard look at this ordinance compared to the downtown plan and some of the ideas for placemaking and what the community wants to see downtown, to see how that fits into what is in this ordinance. And finally, we want to make sure that this ordinance will help accommodate town goals, like having more housing downtown, economic development goals, promoting mixed-use development. So there's a lot in the memo, and so this is kind of just touching on all that, but we can go more into any of these items if people have questions, but I just wanted to get kind of a quick overview first.
Excuse me,
Sure.
I do have one question.
Yeah.
What about sustainability?
Yes, so I didn't highlight that here, but we do, that's not really mentioned much in the current ordinance, but in our sort of plan for writing an ordinance, we want to make sure it accommodates, from an architectural standpoint, things like solar panels and heat pumps, and then also from more of a site design, landscaping standpoint, and Grace can talk more about that, but more sustainability goals. So that'll probably come a little later in the process. And just some more to talk about some of those high-level recommendations. I touched on definitions already. We recommend adding some more specific architectural terms. Again, this is just to make it easier for developers and the review board to set some really specific standards. If something is an addition, if it's an accessory dwelling unit or an additional structure, things like that. And to shift to using some more standard terms that you see both across the state and also in sort of federal language about historic properties. So instead of using terms like locally significant, we'll move to terms like historic property, historic landmark. The kind of standard term is a contributing building if it's of historic significance in a community. On the historic preservation side, currently Freeport uses an A, B, and C system to rank buildings based on their significance. There was a 2019 survey done by a different firm that sort of recategorized these as contributing or non-contributing buildings. So one of our recommendations will be to adopt that format. It just makes it easier for everyone, and it's a much more commonly used way of classifying buildings. So if someone's coming in to build in Freeport, they'll have a better understanding of what that means. And another thing our architectural historian is looking at is the demolition procedures to make sure they kind of accommodate modern needs. Like if you're only demolishing part of a building, what's the procedure for that? And let's see. So another point I wanted to touch on is with updates to the procedure. So right now, I believe there's sort of 3 different types of review under this ordinance. There's a major review, a minor review, and sorry, I don't actually remember. Category 1, Category 2, yes. So what we are, so there's 3 right now. There's Category 1, Category 2, and administrative review. So at our first look, we think it would make more sense to switch to just a major review and a minor review. The major review goes to the board. The minor review is something that is administrative. Make it easier and more in line with kind of what more towns do. And also to just clarify the process and submittals, especially if your project is also going through site plan review or subdivision review, because it's not entirely clear in some cases how all those ordinances fit together. And then in terms of, this is kind of, I guess, the biggest point for discussion, but we haven't talked about it a lot yet. What will the new approval standards be and what will they look like? So our initial plan is that we want to categorize the approval standards that you'll be reviewing projects by, to have a set for those historically significant contributing buildings. We'll have approval standards for those. We'll also have approval standards for non-contributing buildings and new construction. So those are two sort of different things. If you're rehabbing a historic building, you're going to be reviewing different criteria than if you're building a new building that we want to fit into the neighborhood. And in addition to those, we will also have standards for streetscapes, landscapes, and site design. And these standards are really going to be aimed at incorporating the downtown plan goals, sustainability, placemaking, improving the downtown in a way that people have expressed that they want to see. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, so I apologize. But the last thing I just wanted to show is a very confusing map. So this is sort of our initial zoning analysis of what zoning is impacting downtown right now. So the black outlined, the big dark black outlines are the design review districts. The hash mark is the Freeport Village overlay. And then there are 9 underlying zones that are also impacting properties in this area. So I just wanted to share this at this stage because it does create quite a complex set of regulations. And as we move forward with the process, we might have some recommendations about maybe simplifying this or thinking about ways the town can maybe think about zoning changes in the future.
Could I make some comments on that
Yeah.
one?
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, you may as well, but, I mean, obviously the comp plan is being developed at the same time as this plan. It's not being done by you particularly, but by your firm. And it seems to me it's really important, you know, this is a once in a decade period to try to make that much more cogent. So I hope we really will. And then the other thing is that given that overlay, shouldn't the focus of this just be very specifically on design? And in other words, there is no design standard in other areas, and without us touching other areas, we're only talking about design here. So I think the more we can hammer it down to, and what you skipped over, I liked everything you've said and was tracking, and you weren't going too fast. I think most of us followed along with what you're doing, but the whole issue is what is or isn't acceptable. And we haven't, I don't think, figured it out or gotten community consensus on that. And, you know, compatibility has been the big problem because it's so hard to define, and I think everybody hopes we can somehow define what is or isn't acceptable in some more specific way.
So I just want to clarify, Mitch, part of this, they did the zone analysis, looking at the overlay, but obviously underneath, we looked at underneath in the downtown vision. They're not proposing to rewrite the underneath 9 zones. We know that that really needs to be a bigger conversation supported by the comp plan. Hopefully,
Right.
if it's an idea we liked in the vision, it gets incorporated. So important observation that most people here at this point are aware of, but yeah, we won't be focusing on.
I'm tracking completely.
Rewriting.
I just thought.
But it might be a
elevating
recommendation,
that
yeah.
recommendation is a good one, and then it goes over the fence to the other team.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And along those lines too, going over to the other team, one of the frustrations that I've had with the focus on downtown, is that, we have other areas in town that we should also be including in the discussion. So rather than just focusing on the downtown area for this, and then having to go back and look at Mass Landing, South Freeport, Porter's Landing, for example, those are of historical significance, at least to me. Why are we focused on downtown and not talking about the broader picture?
The scope of this work was really just the existing ordinance and the general boundaries of the existing ordinance, which part of the discussion will be shifting, reducing. I think the other areas that have come up really should be discussions at one of the comp plan workshops to see if our community values doing something like this in those other places, because that would need to be something that would need to identify as an action item.
I was
like-
about to sort of double down on what you were saying and saying, once we were talking about design, why aren't we talking about where design is relevant? And I think I heard us sort of insert a historic preservation technique of some kind within this district, and then you wonder about South Freeport, Porter's Landing.
Yeah.
all
And the
that.
Harris
But I
Seacon
think
Historic
what you're
District.
saying is that we don't have a mandate to do that. And without the comp plan saying that the design ordinances should be considered in these districts as well, we only have this district, we can't. I
Right,
think
this,
that's what you're
yeah, this
saying.
was specifically scoped, if we want to branch out, we want to bring that into part of the comp plan
But I think,
project. But Todd's point is, it would be way more efficient to do it all at once, but
Yeah, why
we're just
couldn't
not
we
there
just do
yet.
it? Yeah.
Doing the same thing.
but I think with it, this can provide, in an ideal world, the framework that we build here can apply other places in town. And if
This
we
is
can
a
We
get-
could at least be
priority
thinking about how it
fast-track
could be
project.
extended.
Yeah. Okay, so we're short on time, so,
All right.
sorry.
Well, I was just going to turn it over to the board for discussion. We shared some questions with you beforehand. We really want to let you guide this discussion. Caroline, I don't know if you want to kind of go around the room or if just let people who have.
Sure, let's, I guess, start with Todd. We'll go down this way if you want to kind of address your thoughts on some of the questions that we sent.
I think there's as Mitch alluded to, there's kind of two things we're talking about here. One is people's experience with this ordinance, your thoughts on it, your concerns. The other is, as we start to think about writing those standards, some of those questions of, are we using shall or should? How prescriptive is this going to be? What kind of waivers do we want waivers? What those kind of questions that'll start coming up that will be shaped by the continuing work. But yeah, so I just kind of want to freely open it up for people's thoughts.
I agree with trying to be more clear on what it is that, we're trying to interpret. And one of the things that came out through the Town Down Visit effort was, geez, wouldn't it be great to have a catalog, okay? So that you had examples of, this is what we mean by this. It doesn't mean you have to, go with that manufacturer or that those materials, but it's an example. It's a visual example to help developers or people come in with their applications. I also think, too, I think it was a mistake to go backwards 6 months ago when the ordinance. I think we should be talking about color, for example. I think we should be talking, I think it was just a mistake to back off from the historic, or the downtown district.
Oh, what am I'm not sure. What I've always found is every move we make is almost to repair what we have, to change. Oh, here's somebody that wants something different. We'll adapt to that. So it would be nice to have some general guidelines. Yeah, clarification.
Yeah,
Skip you?
definitely. You can skip me, but I guess only I'd be interested in knowing which towns do you think, New England towns or, towns in the north that you think are doing a good job, that we could look at their design review just for inspiration or to get an idea of on how, other towns are grappling with this and figure out if it's working for them or not, because it's tricky. It's almost like we have a form-based code, but not really, and that's kind of a fine line that we walk between whether we want it or not.
Thank you. That was a good introduction to what I was going to say. I was on with many others here on the Central Core District Working Group, and I know there was generalized discussion about a lot of this, and then we all pared it down to make it a simple thing just to do some quickie changes. One of the items that came up in the early part of that discussion was looking at design standards and having pictures, and we used, I know what we were told to look at was Bar Harbor, and we had picked up a bunch of the standards. I mean, not that we picked it up, but I looked at, and I think others did, looked at those standards that they have, and I would suggest that was a great starting point. It really made my eyes open because I don't know a lot about architectural and historical stuff. So I think that would be a good place to work on some of these standards. There were other things, but I'll leave that to somebody else.
When I review the design review ordinance, I just scratch my head with all the vagueness and openness for interpretation. I don't know how anybody could get anything done with that. So, simplifying that, clarifying that would be great. Also, I keyed in also on the map and what a difficult set of circumstances you have there if you're somebody trying to do something. Well, what zone am I in? Which, I think we could do some simplification around zoning and our overlay districts.
Well, I was wondering if there's something that comes out of this that points us in a direction of saying that we need to be more deliberate about how properties are developed by way of master planning. Right now, we're kind of relying on people showing up, and they have to fit the zoning and so on and so forth. But I feel like if there was more of a sense of purpose and direction, that it might be more conducive to the people showing up, and will lead us down a path of greater coherence. I know that you're not doing that with what you're doing now, but it seems like from sitting on and looking at projects that's not a problem per se, that we don't have that, but that it would help inform things more holistically. Otherwise, kind of drilling down more, some of the things we've wrestled with are like the roof form question, which comes up on every project. If there's, the whole story with there's a flat roof, then people are opposed to it. If what the elusive question about what height is in relation to ground plane and the type of roof form that's used and getting in a number of stories, that sort of clarity around that type of, or that aspect of the built environment would be really helpful. And I found that in the landscape realm, the applicants are coming in with projects, and yes, they have their landscaping, but it ends like right at the property line, and then we've got the whole street edge to deal with, which is basically in tatters for the most part. So you really can't get a good holistic outcome that kind of pulls things together because everyone's doing their own thing. And whoever's working on the streets is, there's really nothing that happens with that. So that's kind of a dead zone in my mind. And then the other thing was materials, where that question comes up often about most people are coming in with some sort of non-traditional material done in a traditional way. And it seems like there's a tendency or desire among board members to want to have more authenticity and try to push for more authenticity, but there's only so far you can go with the materials that are allowed. So I'm wondering if we need to be more specific about that, what's allowed and what's not allowed. And the last thing I wanted to mention was thinking on the historic rehabilitation side. Is it useful in the ordinance to have reference to the National Park Service guidelines when it comes to, it's not necessarily an established set of standards, it's not trying to dictate anything, but a framework for, being able to discuss historic projects that are having additions made to them and in what sort of way.
To answer your last question, that is more typical in towns that are trying to protect some of their historic resources, is to reference those federal standards, which are sometimes a little vague themselves. But yeah, so that's something we can talk about in more detail as we're developing the standards.
Hi, I'm Wayne. I tend to think there's often a trade-off between housing development and prescriptive rules that define the character of neighborhoods and precise subjective character issues like, types of materials and types of landscaping and heights of buildings. And I'm always in favor of addressing the housing crisis. We have a huge affordable housing problem here, and I would like to see a lot more leeway, both in the prescriptive rules and the subjective decisions of the design review to accommodate that.
Andrew, I'm sort of the libertarian too. I remember us watching a court case years ago where the Maine State Law Court come back and said the applicant should be able to read the ordinance and understand what he has to do to pass or fail before he goes to the board. And I don't think you're able to do that in Freeport. I'm a little more laissez-faire. Frank Lloyd Wright would have no place in Freeport. We couldn't have glass front doors, plate glass front doors. We run up and down Main Street and worry about colors, and LL Beans is the only one that doesn't fit, and it's the biggest building on Main Street. The building across the street burned twice in Freeport's history, maybe 3 times, and was a 3-story flat roof. Now it's a 2-story flat roof, and I think we have got so many rules that nobody comes or nobody succeeds. And I'm like Wayne, if we really want housing, I'm not afraid of different architecture. I don't think they all have to fit. You look at these magazines like Discover of Maine or whatever it is, and it shows these pictures from Belfast and Rockland, and there's a 3-story building next to a 1-story candy shop, next to a 2-story house. And they're all a little dissimilar. Some got plate glass windows, some got 6/6. I'm just not afraid of the difference. I think we're gonna design a cookie cutter building, a cookie cutter town where nobody's gonna come, because we can't get anything built in town. It's a good thing we got a railroad, because we'd never get a railroad built in America. It's so complicated. And I've sat at meetings and meetings and meetings for years, planning board, project review before it came along, and the applicants were just so frustrated, they just threw up their hands and said, whatever, 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 the knife at their throat, and they had to get their applicant through. And it's all too overregulated for me. I don't care what color it is. If it doesn't work, somebody else will paint it a different color. I'm just not afraid of that stuff. So.
I think that some of the points that were just raised highlight one of the inherent challenges with this structure in its breadth. Because on one hand, it makes good sense that we don't want to create additional layers. But I think the reality is that what's appropriate on Main Street is different than what might be appropriate in some of the residential neighborhoods that are just around the corner. Current rules apply, we apply the same standard to someone who's trying to build a house as we do to someone who's trying to build a large commercial building on Main Street. I imagine that the sensitivity to historic preservation might be a little bit different in those two areas, but I think maybe that's just my opinion. It would be helpful to delineate that. If in fact that the community sees Main Street to be a different kind of need for historic preservation than in the surrounding neighborhoods, maybe that's an avenue to make housing development easier there. The other piece is that these standards rely, basically every one of them relies so much on visually compatible with nearby classified buildings. I perceive that we've been seeing more applications lately in which there is no nearby classified building. And it leaves us just with no guidance in terms of what to measure against. So being mindful of kind of what to do in the alternative also would be helpful. Similarly, it would help to better understand this visual compatibility. Does that mean if the building that's nearby has a pitched roof, that what you're proposing has to have a pitched roof? I think that's something that has repeatedly come back with applicants about what's the level of congruence that's expected to become visually compatible. I mean, and I think it's been offered. A flat roof next to a pitched roof is not, some have contended that's not visually compatible. That's the type of uncertainty that makes I perceive that makes these ordinances really difficult for designers to build to and plan for. So some direction in terms of those uncertainties would be helpful.
Speak to that for just a quick second. I think that's kind of what a handful of you guys have touched on, is like there's just no real like black and white answer to what development needs to look like. And I think where that like visually compatible line, it's on every single ordinance. And like you said, it doesn't really mean anything. So I think it would be beneficial for us to just kind of remove that sentence and define what appropriate development looks like, rather than relying on matching the buildings next door. Because like some of you said, we don't want everything to look exactly the same. We want that visual compatibility, but it will be inherent if we are defining what appropriate development looks like. So I think that answers a handful of your questions as well.
And when we say define, we mean with numbers and graphics. So there are.
Yep.
So
What
it's-
is or isn't okay.
Yeah. So there's a bit of more of a quantification to these ordinances rather than just, is it visually compatible? I don't know.
One other detail that I add is that, and I think Jason mentioned some of the landscaping needs, that, it's ambiguous in terms of what's expected in terms of landscaping. There's a couple places, that there might be value to consider about provisions that promote protecting existing historic trees, for example. We're hearing some people have expressed the need to protect trees, and there's essentially nothing in the ordinance that's a basis to do that. If in fact that is an objective, a community goal, then folding that into this ordinance, I think would be important.
A lot of my thoughts have been shared already. I get stuck on visually compatible. I'm not an architect, but we're asked to judge whether a project is visually and architecturally harmonious. I don't really know what that means. I think the comment about there are many examples around the country and around the world where you've got a very modern building next to a historic building. It looks fantastic. So let's encourage that. Some of the comments, and you're right up, talked about providing examples of what is and what isn't. I think that'd be very helpful.
So I wasn't part of the downtown vision plan, but I spent some time reviewing it, and I think if we want to implement some of the things that people want there, the thoughts on clarity and simplification and making it easier for applicants and for town staff, I think are really important points to remember as we go forward with this. So I'm excited for that.
After you hear from all of us, I'd be interested to hear from you folks and Caroline if this is dramatically at odds with the way you thought we were going.
So far, no.
Well, let's see if I can change that.
It's up to you.
I really agree with a lot of the comments that have been made. I am in favor of having some controls in this special part of town. It's just one small district. And I actually would have made the district even smaller. We trimmed it recently. I would have personally made it even smaller. But I think the Main Street area is important to protect what we have, but I think it's also going to be under some threat because we don't have the national scale tenants that used to have large budgets on these buildings. And we also have got heightened priorities for residential in town. So this area is going to change more than it ever has. So I'm comfortable personally having some subjectivity, or else we end up with you pick another town that you don't want to look like, and we could be there if we don't have this. but the essence of this is the compatibility. And, I don't know how, you have a design review ordinance without somehow defining this. Linda touched on the Bar Harbor ordinance. I hope you folks will do something, will present us with some ordinances that are already working, that accomplish this, because it's been done for decades. And I think, for me, it's really effective to have photos and say, this works, this doesn't work. And that's what Bar Harbor does for like 15 pages, and maybe you'll come up with something better. And with respect to historic, I do, we move toward an historic ordinance, but you can't really find it in our, as you said, some things are disguised. I think to come right out and decide what we want to do is important. But the National Park Service standards are very, very difficult. I think we've got to think twice before we go too far down that road.
So Ford, I want to egg you on because there's one thing that PRB hasn't brought up that I thought one of you would. You just brought up one, which was the boundaries. The second thing I haven't heard any of you comment on was the 4-month demo period, and your thoughts on that, because that's something that you've seen recently, the 4-month waiting period, and you haven't been seeing it for entire structures, you've been seeing it for like small portions, and that's not something that came up today, so that's something I'd love to hear thoughts on while we're all in a room.
Does anyone feel like we need 4 months to do that?
Well, Central Core got really hung up on this when they talked about it.
I think it's important to have an ordinance like that. I think it's an excessively long period of time.
It was unfortunate for that last one that came to us, where you just wanted to tear down a shed.
Yeah.
And replace it with something much nicer.
Yeah, we've had porches, we've had small enclosed additions, we've had whole houses years ago.
That's embedded in this ordinance,
Current ordinance, yeah.
in the current?
No, we got hung up on it.
We talked
yeah.
about changing it, and then we didn't.
Yeah.
Changing it, making it.
Yeah, but it never
Some
did.
of the things that we did discuss at the working group that we put aside, I guess hoping for this type of, communication with more people.
It was a lot
I
that
think
goes
there
into
are
that
a lot of
category.
those we should just resurrect because we did, like stick them underneath. but
Has that
they're-
been communicated to them, all of your potential changes?
We haven't kind of dug out some of the Central Core. We can revisit that.
There's a lot of time we all spent, and I think we came up with a lot of good things, patting ourselves on the back.
Yeah, and the other thing, that group did look at Bar Harbor. Bar Harbor was not necessarily a stellar example. It's very similar to Freeport, but better in the fact that it's more descriptive, but it's not like a modern ordinance like we're talking about here with modern standards.
Their methods were really good for some people that needed more examples, because they
Yeah.
had on many sheets, compatibility, and they showed the different buildings and where there was compatibility and where something was not.
So it was
was
more
sort of like-
helpful graphically
I was just
than
gonna say,
the
it was-
actual standards.
It was sort of like ours with better pictures.
Yeah, yeah. All right, Sam, you're up. Sorry, I derailed on
No,
the
it's quite all right.
notice period.
Everybody hears me talk plenty, so. I think, seeing what you folks have come up with is, you're certainly on the right track with a lot of the thinking that the Central Core Working Group did in consultation with other boards and, other feedback. And I think, I see it as process improvement really needs to be at the center of this, making it simple and understandable. I think that map amendments and getting to maybe not just one overlay, but at least one overlay at a time would be a great start. It may be that we don't have one overlay that works for the whole town, like a couple of people have said, but if we can have targeted areas, if we say, okay, we want to protect the downtown in a certain way, there are other districts that might be really close, a block, 100 feet away, that are appropriate for different sorts of development, then sure, maybe we have a couple different overlays, but at least only one set of standards that applies at a time would be great. So I think those, if we can improve the process and we can, and part of that is improving the maps and improving the standards that apply in different targeted areas, I think we're going to be off to a great start. The Central Core Working Group struggled a lot with compatibility. We redefined it. I think it's better. It's not great. And I hear coming out in this group the desire for objective standards, but having gone through the process with the Central Core Working Group, where we kind of we all said, okay, the objective standards, let's see, and we dug in a little bit, and it is really hard to come up with objective standards. So I do sort of take Ford's point, that there may be some subjectivity that remains in this ordinance, and that might not be the end of the world, as long as the process can still be straightforward and comprehensible to applicants. So I wouldn't put all my chips on one side or the other on that at this point. I think it's going to be important to see what comes out of this process before we come up with the final form. I think a historic preservation ordinance, I really have thought for a long time that there would be value in that for this town. I really liked what you folks said about having standards that exist for existing buildings, for historically significant buildings, and then a separate set of standards that apply to non-contributing or new construction. I think when I hear discussions about materials and how specific we need to be, really what we're talking about are quality standards, right? We want, it's not so much a pattern book, it's like, how can we wrap our arms around the sort of quality that we want to see in town? How do we define that? Do we not want vinyl siding? Okay, what do we not like about vinyl siding? It's really hard to define. It gets back to the compatibility thing again. So I think, and I like the discussion about streetscapes, and I think that's a really interesting question. Somebody mentioned the tree task force, or maybe not by name, but at least the spirit of this group in town that has sort of started looking at trees in town and landscaping in town. I have no answers to that, but I think that if this process could identify, even if it's just a suggestion of, hey, this is how other communities have dealt with creating landscapes in public places, maybe it's, I'm sure DPW would certainly not want this dropped on their plate, but is there town involvement in certain ways and certain green space, or, how do we regulate, or do we need to regulate, I guess, but I think having that's going to be a big part of this, is creating the landscape and supporting a landscape that makes downtown a comfortable place to be. I have no idea how to do that. And then I think having sort of a quality standard, however that's defined, that applies to a bigger area, and then using space and bulk standards that are different for areas where we might want to promote more housing. I agree with Wayne and Andrew that I don't want to see housing overregulated. I don't want to see the quality standards so high or so specific that developers just throw up their hands and say, well, at 7% interest or whatever the reasons are, we can't build any housing here. So I think we need to be mindful that there will be trade-offs, and if it's allowing bigger buildings or squarer buildings in some parts of town with flat roofs, so be it. And like Andrew said, it really doesn't scare me. I think there are great examples of buildings in other communities that look great and fit in. So yeah, I think that kind of maybe doesn't sum it up, but at least it's some of my thoughts.
Want me to go, or is it board?
Go ahead.
Real quick, you guys remember I have development director in my title, so that's kind of a view shed that I look through is how do we get to yes in a smoother way? So starting from there, the thing that I take away and I kind of think about all the time is the downtown vision really called for 1,200 more people living in and around downtown. And the geography that they delineated roughly corresponds with the geography that we're talking about, at least at this moment, not necessarily town-wide, but at this moment. So,
Brett, can you hit your mic for me?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So that's, I think there's multiple benefits for the town there. It has to be done in a way that the community can live with and enjoy and be proud of. But that's the focus point for me, is making it smoother to get to yes. And one of the things that really excited me about the consulting team, in addition to all the great comments that we've heard so far, is that I think we have a pretty talented landscape architect team that can translate some of our goals into pictures. And I think that that's going to be really valuable, especially as we take the work from this board, or this group, which is arguably the most knowledgeable group of people in town on these standards and how they play at approval processes, to be able to translate where we land out to the general public and have them feel comfortable I think the pictures are going to be really important. So the decisions we make upstream and how you can translate that into pictures, I think is pretty key, and to be mindful of how we start to go down the road with the end goal of pictures being an outcome that we can all live with is key. So those are my 2 points. I'm, development again, so I'm focused on how approvals can add value to the community, economic vitality, address the housing crisis, all that in a way that we can agree with. And I think if we can focus now, early in the process, towards outcomes that translate into pictures, that'll be good for everybody.
Okay. 2 different directions. So first of all, I think subjectivity means no development. That's my point of view.
Did you say no?
None. I think anything that is subjective, especially given the history of this town, is scary as can be. So I'm on the details of if something's not okay, if vinyl siding isn't okay, let's say it's not okay. If a building has to be this big, say it has to be this big. But I don't understand, if it has to be compatible, we have to be able to say what is or is not okay. And to take it one step further, I don't know why we have this ordinance at all. And if I were king, I would delete it and say we have zoning standards and the bulk standards that exist in the zoning, and if that needs to be modified, do it there. So I'm trying to understand what is the overarching goal of this. And so at the same time that we're talking in the weeds of let's be as precise as we can be, I'm wondering, shouldn't we start with some 70,000-foot view of why are we doing this? And so is it to protect the streetscape? Is it to protect the trees? Is it to protect the historic stuff? All 3 of those I would support. We want to protect trees, let's have a tree ordinance. We want to protect historic preservation. That's a tricky one that we have to think about the impact on the owners of those properties, but I think there is a public interest in protecting in historic preservation. I think there's a public interest in having a walkable downtown, whatever that means exactly, and so maybe we can describe that. But if we don't say why we have this thing, I don't know how you can ever resolve it. And so we should be saying, these are the things we care about, and I'm not even sure I know what those things are, because I don't know what material would be unacceptable. I don't know I know what size might be unacceptable, and now to reiterate something somebody else said, on size as an example, the location within those districts matters a lot on the answer to that question. So to have any kind of uniform, anything about size, that's why it should be zoned. And the zoning might have to be very precise on Depot Street as opposed to Main Street or Mallet Drive. So, which brings up only one or two other little points, which is how do we achieve, assuming I'm not right, that we should have a standard and that we do decide what are the values that this standard is trying to uphold. How do we get community consensus on whatever we decide to do? And the only other comment I had, I don't know about waivers or not waivers. I think that's an interesting question.
We don't like waivers.
Yeah.
And hardship comes under the Board of Appeals. Developers
Right.
want clear and predictable standards, and waivers are legally complicated. There's certain cases we can use them. We tend to refer to it at project review as a bad word. And
Because it basically
Clear
throws
standards are
everything
better.
out,
Yeah.
right? So everything you said, this is the nut of it. What is or isn't okay? And I don't even think we even know or would agree, and how do you tease that out, what is or isn't okay? But everything else you said about making it clear, and the 2 classes of contributing buildings and non-contributing buildings, and everything else made 100% sense and seemed like that's all good. It's just we're going to have to get this one done somehow.
all right, so I want to hop over to Zoom.
Wait, no.
Not done yet? Sorry.
We need to have a counter argument.
No, I agree with your first comment, I agree with your second comment. I think it is, the essence of this is the compatibility. The stuff that's the mushiest is the trickiest. And I I think it's productive to figure out what this is and what we want out of it before we get into the details of reclassifying buildings or some of the lesser issues that you raised. One thing that would be helpful to me would be to know what we might end up with buildings if we didn't have design review. What could Main Street, give us some extreme examples.
What are we protecting against? That's what we need to know.
Taco Bell.
Show us what it could be, and then it might help us understand what we
Right,
want.
Taco Bell.
Home Depot in downtown.
Can we not make that determination by doing the negative? I mean, not say, what can we protect against, but what can be the options that we're looking at? I mean, I just don't like the idea of looking at something in a negative
I think,
first.
also, I think, Mitch, you're queuing us up really nicely to start talking about the public engagement piece, too.
I just want to get to Lynn before we do that, because she's the only board member on Zoom.
Sorry, Lynn.
Sorry, Lynn.
And then I think it'd also be good to hear, after Lynn, Guy, if you're still on, I want to put you on the spot, because you have a lot of institutional knowledge on this. So Lynn, you're up first.
Okay, I was delighted to see a reference to the downtown vision plan, because I have been one of the people who has mistakenly brought it up, primarily when we're talking about trees or greening of Main Street. And I've been told we cannot talk about the downtown vision plan because it's not in our design review. So any way you can incorporate some of the positive ideas that came out of that, and I think landscaping streetscapes is a perfect example. That would be a lot of money and a lot of work went into that, and to not for the project review board not to be able to discuss trees related to a project that's going to be downtown ties our hands, I believe. That's number one. The other thing that jumped out at me was that you said take out the definitions like violations. Well, there have been a couple of instances where we have approved something based on our design review standards. The board has been unanimous, sent a strong message to someone, an applicant. Signage comes to mind, and it doesn't come close to what was prescribed. So I don't want violations to be tucked away in procedures, because all of this work we're doing is with the intent of having it followed and not ignored. So violations is and enforcement is something that's on my radar.
That is a good one. Signage is very important, I think, for downtown, that we haven't talked about. So thank you for mentioning that, Lynn.
Sure.
Guy, do you have any thoughts you want to share on this?
I kind of just wanted to sit back and listen to the room. I think everybody's heard me speak over years about the challenges with this ordinance and the improvements that need to be made. And it was nice to see early on in the presentation from the consultants that some of those ideas are things that we've previously discussed. So that was great to see. Freeport's an interesting place because it made a decision in the 1980s to be a retail destination. A result of that decision is kind of an evolving downtown. And so design review, really seeks to, as the board keeps saying, maintain that compatibility with new construction in the downtown with the historic buildings. Because the downtown has evolved so much, it's very, it feels like a checkerboard almost, right? With what we're dealing with what's considered sort of a valuable or historic asset of the town and what's new construction. But I think it's so important for a town that's gone through that kind of development to be able to preserve those places that are important to it. It gives the town a sense of place. It gives it a sense of history. I think it's important for residents who have been here a long time. So Mitch, sorry, I'm going to push back on the idea of just obliterating the ordinance. But design review has been created as a way to toe that line between new construction and the town's intent from the 1980s with a historic preservation ordinance. It tries to do both. And that's always been the challenge with with how this ordinance has been applied, with how it's been interpreted by, obviously a revolving board over the course of decades. So I think a lot of things are up for consideration, and I'm happy this conversation's happening. Glad the consultants are on board. You guys have your work cut out for you, I think. But I'm happy to be involved where I can, but I really want to leave it up to all of you to make those decisions as this ordinance drafting process proceeds.
Could I just make one more comment? I know you want to talk about community consensus, and it's sort of a little bit related to your comment too, which I totally appreciated, like negative, we don't necessarily have to put everything in negative, but how do we get to what are the principles that are guiding us? Like some of them I think would be easy for us to agree to. I think we want a street wall on Main Street. And if anything, the Key Bank violates that street wall, it sort of disappears down that end, but you wouldn't want anybody to violate that anyplace else. I think that creates an experience, but that's something specific we can talk about. And, what we don't want or do want, I think we have to get to that somehow.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, we were looking at the downtown vision plan because it sets these kind of high-level values and goals for what people wanted to see downtown. Some of those values that you mentioned, Mitch, like the streetscapes, the greening downtown, important historic buildings, as well as, the kind of mixed use with residential and commercial that gives you that lively public space. So we have that kind of very high-level view from that project, and I think a lot of what we're doing with the community engagement is trying to see how does that apply to these more specific standards and what we're developing here. So there's basically two aspects of this, in addition to our work with the boards, which we will be having periodic meetings with you all. I'm not sure if we'll do them joint or separate. That's kind of administrative. But we'll also be doing stakeholder outreach. So this stage of the project will be interviews with our team with, first of all, town staff, people who are dealing with this, the boards, as well as community partners like Freeport Housing Trust, the Historical Society, the Chamber, and local businesses and property owners. So I put Bean on the list, but also, just builders and architects, people who are working in this area, who are using this ordinance. So we're going to be basically just talking with these people to talk about their experience with the ordinance and then some additional topic sort of based questions. So with Freeport Housing Trust, questions about like how would this kind of ordinance impact their goals and things like that. So I also want to bring this up because I welcome input from all of you on specific people or businesses or groups we should be talking to. We're still building our list, and the goal is to kind of start with some key folks and then sort of network out from there. So please let us know. You can let Caroline know if you have someone you think we absolutely...
Wouldn't it make sense to include Board of Appeals? Because for Project Review Board, that's the next step. They have to interpret, they should be interpreting what's the ordinance.
Yeah, I can talk to
So
Caroline
that would,
about that.
Yeah,
they would want to have, it fairly simple and clear as well.
we can evaluate if it's
Subjectivity out of it.
appropriate to include them and at what level. One thing you left off here that you mentioned, we are going to do some outreach to DOT.
Yes.
We didn't have really, I think, enough of that during the downtown vision process, and since this is a state road coming through here, we are going to do some outreach to them. They have some planning staff. We feel like that's really important. And the Historical Society does have a design review committee, so that would be something we'd want to involve. They also came to some of the central core meetings. They had some representation there.
I had also the equity committee in town, at least get a little bit of feedback from them as you go forward, because issues of housing is very important to that committee along with other committees, and I think they should have some say in what's going on.
Great.
Really quick comment. There's a category of information that I've always felt lacking, at least for me on the planning board. which is, what have we prevented from being developed in Freeport historically? What applicants have come forward and given up because of our ordinances? So I just don't know what that consists of, and I would love to know more about that.
I think some of it we'll never know. Freeport is always known for its regulations and its high standards. I think back in the day, design review was really well-respected and highly admired by other communities. Like, people used to come in all the time, coming to see those standards that we had to get the McDonald's that we have today. Unfortunately, I think we haven't kept up maintaining it, as we've seen some change of use, we've seen modern materials and some different things. I definitely feel like we've seen a lot of changes in building designs that have come in on most applications as the project review board applies these standards to make them more compatible and fit down. We might have prevented a food chain from coming just because they knew they couldn't fit into these, but some of that, unfortunately we'll never know, like Taco Bell or something, you gave that example. But I think some of it we just won't know because Freeport is known for its standards in cool downtown.
22 Main Street was prevented by some combination of our standards and our process, right?
Well, that was allowed under the standards. It got
sort of.
appealed, but yeah.
But ultimately, the process was the process, and we lost it for some combination of standards and process and interpretation.
Yeah, there were definitely, I think, there's been some recent projects, I don't want to call them out because some are more recent, but because of the subjectivity and maybe too much subjectivity, there's been a lot of opinions as to whether or not certain projects meet these standards, and we continue to see that.
Is it possible to add Freeport Village Station in the conversation, the new management, whomever?
Wilder, yep.
Yeah, because I think that some work needs to be done there.
They've expressed willingness to be part of the process in town. At least
Yeah, we've had some meetings with them initially. Yep. Brett has some great contacts there.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
They met with different people.
One thing, Mitch, that you mentioned, and I think just about everybody has mentioned it, is how do we reduce the risk for developers? So that's the process, make it more clear. So that what you're designing to right away. You're not going to be coming up with a design and having to go back and do a redo. It's very clear. So how can we reduce the risk?
I think in terms of outreach, we should also be conscious of trying to reach out to just property owners within the district. For example, if you talk to architects and builders, I think that you might get a limited perspective of how do we get approvals more easily, which is an important point of view. I would be particularly interested in understanding the viewpoints of existing owners who are faced with, what do I face to modify my building, my property, or change it? Or B, what's at risk for my neighbors changing around me? That type of, it's a different viewpoint that I think is important to include.
I'll give you some real-time feedback to that as a property owner in this district. But I think one sort of category that I don't think you touched on when you mentioned Category 1 and Category 2 and administrative approval, we did put into, when we changed, the Central Core Working Group changed the design review ordinance, whatever that was, 6 months ago, say, we added a specific category that was sort of permit by rule, or it was intended to be specific improvements that would be exempt, that would otherwise be subject to design review, but were exempt. And we pared it way back from what had been a much bigger list. Like I don't even remember.
So for example, the new accessible ramp entrance at Levi's that now didn't have to come through, whereas the project review board has really struggled reviewing accessible ramps because they have to meet code and have certain grade and certain materials. And so that's an example of something that was.
And we had a long list at one point of material substitutions and like roof. The point is, I think keeping some of that in the ordinance is important to, people like me or somebody.
Weekend warriors.
Yeah, the weekend warriors who might want to make improvements to their property And it's just the process itself. It's not the improvement that's daunting, it's the process that's daunting. It's like, I just want to change some clapboards, it's not a big deal, but I don't want to go to the PRB and pay $50 and have to plan 6 weeks ahead and have to, like, that's the part of it that struggles. And so I think that maintaining that is going to be important. And one other comment, just to pick up on something somebody said earlier, because we did have a lot of those, you know, we had a much bigger list of changes that we proposed to make. We scaled it way back. We wanted to sort of leave it to the pros, I think, when we saw this coming down the road, you know, this RFP and putting it out to consultants and people with, you know, more time. It was a big part of it to actually get into the nitty-gritty details, and then obviously more expertise too, in certain areas at least. I think the reason that, not sharing all of that detail is partly by design, to let, I think, you have a chance to look at it with fresh eyes rather than to see all of the stuff that we kind of came up with that might skew your vision. You know, I think if it's helpful to see all of the drafts, I mean, I don't know, certainly it's out there and it represented a lot of hard work. I don't know if it's useful or not. I mean, the stuff exists, but.
We can show them, you know, part of what we're bringing the outside consultant to do is to do this outreach with different community members and stakeholders. So I think they could look at it, but really hearing from a lot of the identified people, or any other ones, if you have thoughts tonight, on who they should reach out to, is important to get community consensus on what's acceptable.
Go ahead.
I wanted to be cautious about repeating myself, but Sam made a comment that I think allows me to. Leaving it to the pros, to me, means, and I agree completely, I'm very nervous about doing this from scratch. This has been done in other towns decades ago, and it worked somewhere, and I'd love to see those examples. And I obviously support community engagement, but we have struggled with this, and we can have 10 more of these meetings, and I don't think we will have refined the thinking greatly without some outside help. So when I think about leaving it to the pros, it's clearly you, but it's also been there, done that, who's been successful.
Okay.
And what's it look like?
Does anyone else, did you have something, Mitch?
Well, you know, I think it was you that made the comment about master planning.
Jason?
And Jason, and I just keep, I'm worried I'm going to repeat myself too. I'm trying to figure out what we're trying to accomplish. And I keep thinking that most of it has to do with the landscape architecture more than the architecture. And my architecture side says, let the flowers bloom. You know, that there's all sorts of new materials and new looks that are today that it may not be incompatible, but any standard, I mean, blocking, sizing, massing, those, you know, height, those all seem really important. But I'm just very worried about architecture, and I'm also thinking about, are there, from a landscape architecture or master plan point of view, are there clear places where we want to do something or wish something? I mean, I wish, you know, I don't know how you do that, but that's what you hope we're trying to do, is place make.
We can, a lot of this, I mean, most of this is private property too, so keep that in mind.
That's what I'm saying, it's private property, so what do you do?
I think,
Yeah.
so the thing, one of the most memorable comments of the Central Core Working Group was maybe the last thing that anyone said. And I don't even remember if he said it just to the group or just to me, but it was Dave LaTulip said, you may, if you put these prescriptive standards in place, you might get a rose, but you're never gonna get a bouquet. And we want a bouquet downtown, right? Like if we are too prescriptive, then we might get like one really cool building over here, and then we might stifle a whole bunch of other development that we might have gotten. And I think it's not that every building is gonna be the perfect building in Freeport, but at some point, we're gonna have a community and we're gonna have a place that is cohesive in its own, you know, for certain of its own merits. So, I don't know.
Yeah, Mitch, to your point a little bit there, I think the purpose of a design, like guideline, design ordinance, is like this preservation of character. Freeport has a character. You don't want to deviate too far from it, but you do want to allow new development to happen. So that's what these design ordinance standards will help you do, is like identify what that character is and how to like have new development happen and like be guided properly to remain within that idea of what the character is.
And I think want to move on to our final item, but I also think that what Grace's team will be doing will include these sort of landscaping standards that can be done at the scale of site design. So what you've done for like some other communities is basically provided guidelines or regulations for if you're going to develop a site. These are, this is like the green space that needs to be here. This is the landscaping at the front. This is sort of the public facing versus, I don't know if you want to talk more about that, but we'll definitely be talking more about that later. I guess the final point I just wanted to get to is, so for engagement with the larger community, what we have been talking to town staff about is that we are going to do this mostly in the format of pop-ups where we're kind of tagging along to other town events. There's a lot of stuff going on in Freeport right now, so we want to have pop-ups at some of the comp plan events. Maybe we'll have one at Election Day or something like that. Maybe some places, oh no, how does that? Oh, sorry. Maybe some places downtown. The details we're still working out, but the goal of these larger community discussions is to use visuals to get feedback from people on how we can better define compatibility. So you could call it a visual preference survey. Some people call it a design charrette. It's really just the idea is that we'll have pictures. Some will be sketches, some will probably be photographs. We'll work with Grace to do that, to where people can react to, do you think this kind of building belongs downtown? Do you think this kind of building belongs on Main Street? And some of the things we'll be asking people for feedback on are building height and massing. So you can show different scales of buildings and ask people, put a red sticker on this if you think it belongs on Main Street. Put a green sticker if you think it would be okay on Depot Road but not on Main Street. We can also ask questions about materials, other architectural features like patterns of a facade, windows, roof pitch. And I think a big thing we're curious to see community feedback on, which a few of you have touched on, is the idea of contemporary design. Is it okay if a new building downtown has contemporary design? Is it okay on Depot Street? Is it okay on Main Street? Is it okay for an addition? Those sorts of questions. So yeah, and especially this idea of, is there a difference between Main Street and surrounding streets? So that's sort of how we want to start to get some wider feedback into what people think about compatibility.
So I do just want to clarify this from the board. We're getting some mixed comments on the comp plan workshops. People, I think, are feeling a little bit of burnout because we did a downtown vision plan, and then we did a climate action plan, and then we're doing 4 comp plan workshops, and they've put up dots on a lot of things, and to the 14 of us, all of those mean different things, but to them, they're like, we already stuck dots on a piece of paper, and now we're doing it again. So we're trying to be really aware. And if the public's coming out piggybacking on some of those opportunities, we are able to share some of the visual preference surveys that we did during the downtown visioning with the dots. Clearly, since then we've seen some applications come forward, we know we need to refine some of those ideas a little more of what people really want to see there, because we're not quite there. We might do some like stakeholder outgroups with some like business owners, property owners, stuff like that. If we do have things kind of in a larger public setting, it will most likely be in meeting before the planning board, just to kind of avoid public burnout. But you'll probably see the team at some of your upcoming comp plan workshops. And one of the nice thing about partnering with North Star and their partners on this is that they're leading the comp plan process, so they can integrate where they feel is appropriate.
The community barely needs to know that these are 2 separate efforts, really. I mean, if you just said it's almost like
Trying to figure out what to do downtown.
we're part of the whole.
Separate, but might overlap in some cases, like housing workshop would be a good intersection.
Yeah, but it's just while we're having housing, if over there they're saying, hey, this is the design corner, we want to collect your opinions on, do you like this or that or that? It'll all feel natural.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's great to do sort of a bottoms-up view, which is what I'm hearing, but I'm also hearing that there's probably been bottoms-up view efforts for years and years and it's gotten nowhere. I think Ford hit on something that's been in my mind, which is really what are communities in the U.S. or in the world that have faced something similar, and what does it look and feel like? Me, as a citizen, if I had some views of this is XYZ town and this is what they did, I'd say, yeah, I really like that. That would be great for Freeport. So more of a vision approach developed by a smaller group rather than looking for the entire population to give their individual views would be very helpful. The other thought I had too was, you know, Waterville Main Street is going through a metamorphosis, fortunately with some good funding, but they've done some things right there. That may be something to look at too, how they've done it. And
Where?
Waterville?
Waterville, Maine?
Waterville.
I have also a comment about presentation to the public to get the feedback, because and I don't even know if I should say this, but the vision planning part that I did not like at all was when we were presented with all of the pictures of a 3-story building, a 4-story, a 5 or a 6, you know, which one do you like better? They were all disjointed from anything around that you would see with one of those buildings. And I would make a suggestion that when you do that type of thing to the public, maybe there is an overlay method, you know, have the picture of this section of Main Street, and then show, if you had a building that was 4 stories put in between these two, would you like that? Because you need to have it in context.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's one of the things where, you know, we haven't gotten to the point where we've designed this yet, but one of the things we've talked about is how to communicate these things in context. So, because it can be very difficult for people abstractly to say, I like this building, I don't like this. So I think tying it to the ground is part of our goal here.
So you don't want to get an impression that everybody loves a 4-story building now, because that's where all the red and green dots came on. When once you try to put one, it's like, oh my gosh, you know.
Hey, you have 2 minutes. I know you have a hard stop. So anything else you need from the board tonight?
I think, you know, that was sort of the questions that we wanted to cover. And actually, Ben and I switched, so I'm staying with Charles. So we can keep talking if we need to.
Okay, so, yeah, I know some people, we had a 5:30 stop, so we like to plan, but Kate's gonna linger, so if you wanna hang out a little bit, you can. If you sleep on it and you have additional comments on anything we talked about today or other stakeholder groups, I ask that you email me directly by the end of the day Monday, and I will compile any and additional comments and email them to Kate and the team so they can get those thoughts.
I got one quick one. I don't want to over-index on the point of view of developers, but we don't know the opinions of the developers that are scared off to come to Freeport. And I wonder if there are just active developers in Portland or in Brunswick who we could just say, you know, what do you think about Freeport? And, you know, they may have some very clear.
I think Brent probably has some of that feedback too.
I do, yeah.
I'd like to piggyback on some of that, because we can sit around here and dream up all these ordinances, and without an applicant, they just don't mean anything.
Right.
And that's what I was getting at when I asked the question about what have we prevented from coming. I'd like to know what we could be getting here and how we could welcome that without, you know, subverting our.
Asking a negative question to get a positive answer. I mean, how do you do that?
And we can say stuff like, we've prevented a Walmart, or a Home Depot, but what they bring to Freeport, they're not gonna come anyways, because it doesn't work for them. So, you know, you can't keep dragging that boogeyman out, you know, we've prevented a Walmart, or we've prevented the worst Burger King in the world, you know, I mean, but they're just not gonna come, you know? McDonald's came years ago, probably just to throw a steak down, because Beans was here maybe, but, you know, we don't really know why, and great, I mean, you know, we forced them into a building, and everybody loves it, but I'm with Wayne, I mean, you know, what are we stopping here? I mean, what are we scared of? So, without an applicant, all these rules are just a lot of fun, and we write it all down on paper, but until somebody steps up and throws money on the table, and lots of times when they do, they go away without a project, so, you know, they just spend $150,000, $200,000 in a year and a half, and, no, I got overturned, or I'm done, or I give up.
I do want to put that in context, because I'm very sensitive to the point that's made about having a bad reputation and so forth. We've only, the 5 years I've been on the board, 5 or 6, we've never denied a project. 22 Main Street was a turning point. It's what put us all in this room, I think, because we don't have an ordinance that was responsive to that. But we've not caused a lot of applicants to come in here and not get what they came for.
Well, Carolyn said we have a reputation as a regulated community.
I think we do have a reputation as a regulated community, good or bad. I mean, I've always felt like there's a draw why people want to come to Freeport, and unfortunately, part of that is the regulation. I think we've worked really hard with developers to get them to a point that a project is acceptable to the community. I think that also contributes to our perception to be difficult to work with, because they're like, that Caroline asked me to put mullions on the building, you know? Stuff like that. So I think we do have that perception, but Ford's right, like, the board works so hard and the town works so hard to work with applicants to get them to a point. There are some people that haven't come back, and I do think a lot of times, you know, it's been smaller projects, like they might only have a budget for vinyl and they don't want to do a, you know, different material to be compatible or something like that. And then sometimes projects fall apart for reasons other than us. We're just one of the reasons, particularly like today with the economics of it.
But Ford, going back to your point, it would be really nice if some of those bigger projects that I think you're referencing, that we worked with them on, if they came into the room with something that worked right off the bat, if they had that guidance up front. So we don't have to go, they don't have to spend money going back and forth on design and, you know, time and all of that. If we can simplify that process so that when they come in, it's like, yeah, you got it.
Yeah, and clear standards are key, because
No, we don't give Ed much more work, but we give him to make a new message to go out there, that this is a town that welcomes people, rather than, you know, once you get through all those ordinances, we're happy to see you. You know, I'm just saying that the message could be important now, and let people know we do not deny everything. We just don't.
And on that, I am going to have us wrap up, because Tom has generously filmed this meeting, but now he's getting ready for a 6 o'clock live televised meeting. So he has some stuff he needs to do to the room. So thank you to everyone for attending, and ladies for staying a few minutes over so we could continue the conversation. Lynn, thank you for hanging out with us on Zoom tonight. I am going to go ahead and end the
Good night,
meeting.
Guy.
Thank you, everyone. Guy had to leave early.
Oh, he did, okay.
If I were a consultant.
Good stuff, huh?